In the top stories, duty-free concessions announced for Christmas. Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu to go to international courts for redress. And day 2 of COP26 summit wraps up with major climate change. Hello and welcome to the ZIZ Midday newscast. We apologize for the late start due to technical difficulties, but let's get right into the news. Nationally, Prime Minister Dr. the Honorable Timothy Harris has announced a number of duty-free concessions aimed at easing financial burdens this Christmas season. During his presentation on leadership matters on Tuesday night, the Prime Minister announced that the government has increased the maximum amount of foodstuff allowed to be imported duty-free.
The regular allowance of gift packages of foodstuff will be revised to allow the first £500 free of duties and taxes. In prior years, only the first £100 were exempted. This most generous concession and food items will start not in December, as was previously done, but from November 15th, 2021, and will be extended to February 28th, 2022.
He also noted that during December, the duty-free limit has been raised when it comes to travelers bringing in non-commercial goods duty-free.
Normally, travelers receive a duty-free allowance of EC $400 off the CIF value. My government has again brought more relief to our people by increasing the duty-free allowance to travelers, and goods valued at EC $540 or US $200 during the period 1st December until the 31st of December 2021.
Financial Secretary Hilary Hazel told ZIZ News that this exemption also applies to imported goods bought online and shipped via courier services. The final concession relates to vehicles. No VAT would be charged on the first $50,000, and values greater than $50,000 will be subject to the usual 17% VAT. These concessions will accompany the 2 reduced VAT days, which will be announced at a later date. Advancing in its mission to fulfill the 2017 to 2021 Education Sector Plan mandate for Program Area 4, Professionalizing the Teaching Force, the Ministry of Education will be hosting a consultation session on Thursday at 1:30 p.m. The virtual consultation session, supported by the Organization of American States Development Cooperation Fund, will be spearheaded by Dr. Marcia Stewart and Mrs. Elaine Foster, members of the OAS-DCF consultation team. Targeting individuals in senior leadership positions within the ministry, the one-day session will focus on revising the professional standards for the national teaching profession and revising the performance appraisal system for the education sector. In other news, senior officials working in the tourism industry will be featured on the radio and TV program Working for You later today. The special guests will be Carleen Henry Morton, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Tourism, and Raquel Brown, Chief Executive Officer of the St. Kitts Tourism Authority. The discussion will focus on how the pandemic has affected tourism and the rebuilding efforts within the tourism industry. An overview of Tourism Awareness Month will also be presented. Working for You is broadcast live every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. on ZIZ Radio and social media platforms, as well as the Facebook page and YouTube channel of the SKNIS. We now move to news on the regional scene. Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown, continues to make a call for compensation for small states for the damage from the warming of the planet. He addressed fellow world leaders at the COP26 summit in Glasgow on the heels of an agreement with Tuvalu to take the world's biggest polluters to international courts if no compensation arrangement is forged. ABS's Jamie J. Rocher reports.
Prime Minister Gaston Brown addressing world leaders at major climate summit COP26. He warned his colleagues the world is teetering dangerously on the precipice of a climate catastrophe. Prime Minister Brown says if global temperatures surpass 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels, there will be fatal consequences for all, especially small island developing states or ZIZ. The head of the Alliance of Small Island States says the grouping is troubled by the uncertainty of the future.
The difference between small island developing states and industrialized nations is the capacity to respond. It takes a single storm, a few hours, to destroy the economy and infrastructure of an entire small island state.
He says the countries do not have the resources to respond and rebuild, and developed countries have failed to honor their promise to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance. The Prime Minister says the situation has weakened the country's ability to plan their economic and social development with predictability. He reminds the COP26 summit that ZIZ contribute very little to climate change but suffer the worst effects.
USIS calls for direct attention to loss and damage at this COP as a distinct issue in its own right, not just on the margins of adaptation.
He cautions member countries may seek justice in international bodies if the summit doesn't establish a formal loss and damage mechanism.
COP26 should deliver the following commitments: reduce emissions to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, scale up and accessible adaptation and mitigation funding, and a firm mechanism for loss and damage.
Prime Minister Brown says this is the last decade the world has to avoid the worst impacts of global warming. He says COP26 is the last chance to deliver on ambitious commitments and actions to avert catastrophic consequences. Jimmy J. Roche, ABS News.
Internationally, several major deals were announced on Tuesday as the World Leaders Summit wrapped up. More in this Euronews report.
There appeared to be much camaraderie between world leaders and possibly a modicum of relief before they took their leave of the COP26 stage in Glasgow. In the first 48 hours of the 12-day conference, there certainly has been a flurry of announcements, giving a sense of progress. The first of two key commitments, termed Ending the Great Chainsaw Massacre by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has more than 100 countries promising to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. It includes Brazil, although skeptics wonder if President Bolsonaro is really committed to action. A similar number backed a joint initiative by the EU and USA to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030, although the biggest emitters, Russia, China and India, were not among them. And later there was a pledge by more than 40 leaders to boost the uptake of low-carbon technologies. Host of the conference, Boris Johnson, said he was optimistic, but still cautious.
We must take care to guard against false hope and not to think in any way that the job is done, because it is not. There is still a very long way to go. My message to them, to the negotiators, is very simple. The leaders of the world may have left or are leaving COP now, but I can tell you that the eyes of the world, the eyes of the populations of the world are on you, and the eyes of the British government and all the other governments that care about this are on our negotiators.
And it's these negotiators who will now start to thrash out the painstaking detail of a climate accord, along with having to convince all the UN member states to back the climate pledges and how to fund them. And while presidents and prime ministers may have gone, environmental activists are going nowhere. They're still waiting to be convinced.
And now for the weather. Present weather is cloudy skies with adjacent showers. Winds are a moderate breeze of 13 miles per hour from an easterly direction. The temperature for today is 25 degrees Celsius or 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Seas are moderate with waves of 4 to 6 feet with swells of 1.5 meters or 5 feet. A high surf advisory remains in effect. The weather forecast for St. Kitts and Nevis for today and tonight will be partly cloudy with a a 60% or moderate chance of showers. Sunset today will be at 5:39 p.m. Sunrise tomorrow at 6:10 a.m. And that brings us to the end of the ZIZ Midday Newscast. Join us this evening for these stories and more in detail. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Jason Davis.